The fog hung thick over the Belgian countryside on the morning of December 16th, 1944, like a gray shroud concealing death itself. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez of the 101st Airborne Division squinted through the mist. From his foxhole near Bastogne, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter cold. The silence was unnatural, broken only by the distant rumble of what sounded like thunder, but there were no storm clouds. Overhead, "You hear that, Sarge?" whispered Private Tommy Walsh, his young face pale beneath his helmet. At 19, Walsh had been with the Screaming Eagles since Normandy, but something about this morning felt different. Rodriguez nodded grimly. The rumbling grew louder, more distinct. Not thunder tanks, lots of them. The German counteroffensive that Allied intelligence had deemed impossible was beginning to unfold before their very eyes. The first artillery shells began falling at 0530 hours, shattering the morning stillness with explosive fury. The ground trembled beneath the paratroopers as they scrambled from their temporary rest positions. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuis, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, emerged from his command post to witness the nightmare materializing through the fog. All companies, defensive positions now. Chapuis barked into his radio, his voice cutting through the chaos. The seasoned officer had jumped into Normandy and fought through the liberation of France, but the scale of this German assault was unprecedented. Through the mist, dark shapes emerged, panzer tanks of the 2nd Panzer Division, their guns traversing to find targets among the scattered American positions. The town of Bastogne, a crucial crossroads in the heart of the Ardennes, suddenly became the most important piece of real estate in Western Europe. 7 roads converged on this small Belgian market town, making it a strategic prize that could determine the success or failure of Germany's last major offensive on the Western Front. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the movement of entire armies. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, received the emergency call at 0700 hours. His division, supposedly resting and refitting after the grueling campaign in Holland, was being thrown into the path of an entire German army corps. The paratroopers had expected a quiet Christmas in reserve instead. They found themselves racing toward what would become one of the most legendary defensive battles in military history. As Rodriguez and his men loaded into trucks bound for Bastogne, the magnitude of their situation became clear. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and about to be surrounded by elite German forces desperate to break through Allied lines and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The fog that had concealed the German approach now seemed to envelope the paratroopers themselves, carrying them toward a destiny that would test every ounce of their courage and determination. The trucks rolled through the Belgian countryside while artillery fire echoed in the distance, each mile bringing the Screaming Eagles closer to their appointment with history. Behind them, the German offensive was already punching massive holes in American defenses, creating the bulge that would give the battle its name. The convoy of trucks carrying the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment thundered through the pre-dawn darkness of December 17th, their headlights cutting through the swirling snow that had begun to fall. Colonel Howard Johnson, the regimental commander, sat in the lead vehicle studying his maps by flashlight, trying to make sense of the fragmentary reports crackling over the radio. "Sir, we're getting word that German armor has broken through at Clairvaux," reported Major William Pels, the regimental operations officer. "The 28th Infantry Division is falling back on multiple fronts. Looks like we're walking into the middle of a hurricane." Johnson nodded tersely. The reports were confused and contradictory, but one thing was clear: German forces were advancing rapidly toward Bastogne from multiple directions. The paratroopers would have to establish defensive positions quickly or risk being overrun before they could organize an effective defense. As documented in the official U.S. Army historical records, the speed of the German advance caught Allied commanders completely off guard. The 8 corps, responsible for defending the Ardennes sector, had been caught with insufficient forces spread across an impossibly wide front. Now the 101st Airborne was being rushed forward to plug the gaps before the German spearheads could reach their objectives. Captain Richard Winters of Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, watched the landscape flash past the truck windows as they approached Bastogne. The veteran company commander had led his men through some of the war's fiercest battles, but the reports they were receiving suggested this would be different. Instead of attacking, they would be defending, fighting from prepared positions against overwhelming odds. "Keep your weapons ready, men," Winters called to his soldiers. "Intelligence reports German paratroopers operating behind our lines. Could be anywhere." The truth was even more ominous than Winters realized. Colonel Otto Skorzyny's Operation Grief had infiltrated English-speaking German commandos in American uniforms deep behind Allied lines. These saboteurs were already working to disrupt communications, misdirect reinforcements, and spread confusion throughout the American rear areas. By noon on December 17th, the first elements of the 101st Airborne Division had reached Bastogne and begun establishing defensive positions around the town's perimeter. The paratroopers took over from the retreating elements of the 9th Armored Division's Combat Command Reserve, whose tanks had been conducting a fighting withdrawal from the advancing German forces. Sergeant Rodriguez found himself digging in along the eastern approaches to the town, where the main Bastogne-Longville road offered the most direct route for German armor. The frozen ground was like concrete, making each shovelful a struggle, but the distant rumble of approaching tanks motivated every man to dig deeper and faster. "Sarge, look at this," Private Walsh called from his position. Through his binoculars, he could see a long column of American vehicles retreating westward along the road trucks, jeeps, and the occasional tank, all moving with the urgent haste of men fleeing a superior enemy. Among the retreating forces were remnants of Combat Command Reserve of the 10th Armored Division, whose Sherman tanks and tank destroyers would prove crucial in the coming siege. These armored vehicles, though fewer in number than their German counterparts, would provide the heavy firepower necessary to blunt enemy attacks. The snow continued to fall as darkness approached, blanketing the Belgian countryside in deceptive white beauty beneath that pristine surface. The armies were maneuvering for position in what would become one of World War II's most decisive battles. He raced for Bastogne was about to begin in earnest, with the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division standing directly in the path of Hitler's last great gamble. The morning of December 19th brought devastating news to the defenders of Bastogne. German forces had succeeded in cutting the last remaining roads leading into the town, completing the encirclement of the 101st Airborne Division and attached units. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez watched through his field glasses as German vehicles moved across the distant hills, sealing off any hope of retreat or reinforcement by land. "Well, boys, looks like we're officially surrounded," announced Lieutenant Robert Brewer to the men of 1st Platoon. The young officer tried to keep his voice steady, but everyone could hear the tension beneath his words. "Orders are to hold our positions at all costs. No withdrawal, no surrender." The paratroopers had faced encirclement before during Operation Market Garden in Holland, but this situation was different. Then, they had expected relief within days. Now, with German forces controlling all approaches to Bastogne, rescue seemed impossible. The weather had closed in completely, grounding Allied aircraft and eliminating any possibility of air support or supply drops. Private Walsh huddled deeper into his foxhole as German artillery began its daily bombardment. The shells fell with methodical precision, walking across the American positions in search of command posts and supply dumps. Each explosion sent frozen earth and debris raining down on the defenders, a constant reminder of their precarious situation. "At least we don't have to worry about where the enemy is," Walsh muttered to Rodriguez during a brief lull in the shelling. "They're everywhere except behind us, and that's only because there ain't no behind us left." The truth of Walsh's observation became clear as German forces launched their first major probe against the eastern perimeter. Elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division advanced through the snow-covered fields, their white winter uniforms making them nearly invisible against the landscape. Only the sharp eyes of experienced paratroopers spotted the movement in time to bring devastating defensive fire to bear. Corporal James Hendricks, manning a .30 caliber machine gun in a hastily constructed bunker, opened fire as the German infantry approached within 50 yards of the American positions. His belt-fed weapon chattered continuously, cutting down the advancing soldiers and forcing the survivors to seek cover in shell craters and behind fallen trees. "More coming from the north," shouted Sergeant Frank Piccone from his observation post. Through the swirling snow, he could see another company of German soldiers moving to flank the American positions. The enemy was probing for weak points, testing the resolve of the surrounded paratroopers. Major Winters coordinated the defensive fire, directing mortar rounds toward the advancing German formations, while his riflemen picked off individual targets. The paratroopers' training and experience showed clearly in their disciplined fire control, every shot carefully aimed, every round making maximum impact against the enemy advance. By afternoon, the German probe had been repulsed with heavy casualties, but the message was clear: the enemy was testing American defenses, gathering intelligence for larger attacks to come. Colonel Joseph Harper, commanding the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, studied the pattern of enemy movements and began repositioning his forces. To meet the expected assault, the supply situation was becoming critical. Ammunition expenditure during the morning's fighting had consumed nearly 20% of available reserves, while medical supplies were already running dangerously low. The wounded from previous engagements filled every available building in Bastogne, and more casualties were arriving hourly. Captain Eugene Rowe, the battalion medic, moved through the aid station established in the town's church basement. The wounded lay on stretchers and blankets spread across the stone floor, their faces pale in the flickering candlelight. Morphine was almost gone. Bandages were being improvised from torn clothing. A plasma for treating shock victims had been exhausted completely. "Doc, when are we getting resupplied?" asked a wounded private whose left arm hung useless at his side. Rowe looked into the young soldier's eyes, searching for words of comfort that he wasn't sure he believed himself. "Soon, son. The Air Corps will get through to us soon." Outside the church, the snow continued to fall while German artillery maintained its steady harassment of the American positions. The siege of Bastogne had begun in earnest, and the 101st Airborne Division was about to face the ultimate test of their courage and determination. December 20th dawned gray and bitter, with temperatures plummeting well below freezing and no sign of the weather clearing. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stamped his feet in his foxhole, trying to maintain circulation in his frozen extremities. Around him, the other paratroopers of the 501st Regiment prepared for what intelligence reports suggested would be the Germans' first major assault on Bastogne's perimeter. The attack came at 0830 hours, preceded by the heaviest artillery bombardment the defenders had yet experienced. German guns of every caliber pounded the American positions for 45 minutes, turning the frozen earth into a moonscape of overlapping craters. When the barrage finally lifted, the silence that followed was more ominous than the explosions had been. "Here they come," shouted Private Walsh, his voice barely audible over the sudden roar of diesel engines. Through the smoke and snow, the distinctive silhouettes of German Panzer IV tanks emerged, their long guns traversing to engage American positions. Behind them came waves of infantry in winter camouflage, advancing with the disciplined precision of veteran troops. Lieutenant Colonel Chapuis coordinated the defense from his forward command post, calling for artillery support from the 101st Organic Guns. The American artillery, though outnumbered, responded with devastating accuracy. The first German tank exploded in a shower of sparks and flame as a direct hit penetrated his frontal armor. Sergeant Rodriguez aimed his M1 Garand rifle carefully, leading the German soldier who was advancing by bounds across the snow-covered field. His shot took the enemy in the chest, spinning him around before he collapsed into a shell crater. Around him, the other paratroopers maintained steady, disciplined fire that began to slow the German advance. The battle raged for 6 hours, with German forces repeatedly attempting to penetrate the American defensive line. Tank after tank was destroyed by bazookas, anti-tank guns, and artillery fire, while German infantry found themselves pinned down by the accurate shooting of experienced paratroopers. The Wehrmacht troops, despite their numerical superiority, could not break through the determined American defense. Captain Richard Spears, commanding Dog Company of the 2nd Battalion, led a desperate counterattack against the German penetration on the northern perimeter. His men advanced through withering machine gun fire, clearing German positions with grenades and bayonets in vicious close-quarters fighting. Spears himself killed 3 German soldiers with his Thompson submachine gun before the enemy position was finally silenced. "That's how we do it, Screaming Eagles," Spears called to his men as they consolidated the recaptured position despite being surrounded and outnumbered. The paratroopers maintained their aggressive spirit, counterattacking whenever the opportunity presented itself. The German assault finally broke off at 1500 hours, leaving the snow-covered battlefield littered with destroyed equipment and casualties from both sides. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division had suffered enormous losses for minimal gains, while the American defenders had proven their ability to hold their positions against overwhelming odds. Medical personnel worked frantically to treat the wounded from both sides. Captain Rowe established aid stations and buildings throughout Bastogne, treating German prisoners with the same care given to American casualties. The Geneva Convention was strictly observed, despite the brutal nature of the fighting, as documented in post-war German military records. The failure of this first major assault against Bastogne came as a shock to the Wehrmacht High Command. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, had expected his forces to overwhelm the American defenders within hours. Instead, he found himself facing a determined enemy that showed no signs of breaking under pressure. The supply situation continued to deteriorate as the day wore on. Ammunition was being rationed carefully, with each company receiving only enough for one more major engagement. Food had been reduced to K-rations supplemented by whatever could be found in abandoned Belgian homes. Most critically, medical supplies were virtually exhausted, forcing medics to perform surgery without anesthesia and reuse bandages from the dead. Despite these hardships, morale among the paratroopers remained remarkably high. These were veterans who had jumped into Normandy on D-Day and fought their way across France. They had faced impossible odds before and emerged victorious. As night fell on December 20th, the men of the 101st Airborne Division prepared for whatever the morning might bring, confident in their ability to hold the line. The morning of December 22nd brought an unexpected visitor to the besieged garrison of Bastogne. Under a white flag of truce, German officers approached the American lines carrying an ultimatum from General von Lutwitz. Major Alvin Jones, the division intelligence officer, brought the surrender demand directly to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe at his command post. In the Heinz barracks, McAuliffe read the pompous German ultimatum twice, shook his head, and uttered the single word that would become legendary in American military history: nuts. When asked by his staff what response should be sent to the Germans, McAuliffe's initial reaction needed no elaboration. Colonel Joseph Harper, tasked with delivering the reply, typed out the famous one-word response and personally carried it to the waiting German emissaries. "I have the honor to deliver the American commander's reply to your ultimatum," Harper announced formally to the bewildered German officers. When they asked for clarification of the colloquial American expression, Harper grinned and explained, "It means go to hell." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and the other paratroopers learned of their commander's defiant response within hours, and the news spread through the American positions like wildfire. The men cheered and laughed despite their desperate situation, drawing strength from McAuliffe's refusal to even consider surrender. If their general was confident enough to tell the Germans to go to hell, then the Screaming Eagles would keep fighting. The German reaction to this rejection was swift and brutal. Artillery fire increased dramatically, with shells falling on Bastogne at the rate of one every 15 seconds. The systematic bombardment targeted medical facilities, supply dumps, and command posts, causing numerous casualties among both military personnel and Belgian civilians who had remained in the town. Private Walsh crouched in his foxhole as German shells screamed overhead, impacting with earth-shaking explosions throughout the American defensive perimeter. The continuous barrage was clearly designed to break the morale of the defenders, but the paratroopers had endured worse during their training in previous combat operations. "They're just wasting ammunition," Walsh called to Rodriguez during a brief lull in the shelling. "Every round they fire at us is one less they'll have when Patton gets here." The mention of General George Patton's Third Army raised hopes throughout the besieged garrison. Audio intercepts had confirmed that Patton was driving his forces northward through Luxembourg, racing to break the German encirclement of Bastogne. The question was whether the paratroopers could hold out long enough for relief to arrive. Combat conditions continued to deteriorate as the siege entered its second week. Frostbite casualties were mounting rapidly, with many defenders suffering from exposure-related injuries that rendered them unfit for combat duty. The wounded filled every available shelter, while those who died were placed in a makeshift morgue established in a bombed-out warehouse. Morphine had been exhausted days earlier, forcing him to perform amputations and extract shrapnel without adequate pain relief. His medical bag contained only sulfa powder, a few remaining bandages, and instruments that had been sterilized over candle flames. The ammunition shortage had become critical, with some rifle companies down to fewer than 50 rounds per man. Machine gun crews were rationing their fire to short, precise bursts, while mortar teams saved their remaining shells for only the most desperate situations. Artillery support was limited to emergency defensive fires, as the division's guns had less than 20 rounds per tube remaining. Despite these overwhelming challenges, the paratroopers maintained their defensive positions and continued to repel German probes. Lieutenant Colonel Chapuis organized night patrols to gather intelligence on enemy movements, while company commanders rotated their men through warming stations, established in Bastogne cellars to prevent wholesale casualties from exposure. As December 22nd drew to a close, the men of the 101st Airborne Division faced their darkest hour. Surrounded, outnumbered, and running desperately short of supplies, they nonetheless maintained their fighting spirit. General McAuliffe's defiant nuts had become a rallying cry that embodied the paratroopers' refusal to surrender despite impossible odds. The stage was set for the climactic phase of the siege, as both sides prepared for what could be the final battle for Bastogne. December 23rd marked the most critical day of the siege, as German forces launched their most determined assault yet against the shrinking American perimeter. The attack began before dawn with a concentrated artillery barrage that surpassed anything the defenders had previously experienced. For 2 hours, German guns of every caliber pounded the American positions, turning Bastogne itself into a blazing inferno. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez huddled in his collapsed foxhole as shells burst all around his position. On the eastern perimeter, the constant explosions had long since numbed his hearing, reducing the world to a series of pressure waves and flying debris. When the barrage finally lifted, he emerged to find his sector of the defensive line badly damaged, with several positions completely destroyed. Sound off, Rodriguez called to his remaining men. Of the 12 soldiers in his squad, only 7 responded. Private Walsh crawled out of a nearby shell crater, blood streaming from a shrapnel wound on his forehead, but still clutching his rifle with determination. The German ground assault that followed was unlike anything the paratroopers had faced. During the siege, elements of the Panzer Lehr Division, elite mechanized troop who had been held in reserve, now joined the attack with fresh tanks and veteran infantry. Their objective was clear: punch through the American defenses and capture Bastogne before any relief force could arrive. Lieutenant Colonel Chapuis watched from his observation post as German armor advanced across the snow-covered fields in overwhelming strength. Panzer V Panther tanks, nearly invulnerable to American anti-tank weapons, led the assault while motorized infantry followed in half-tracks and armored personnel carriers. The first line of American defenses, held by Easy Company under Captain Winters, came under tremendous pressure as German forces concentrated their attack on a narrow front. The paratroopers' bazookas proved ineffective against the frontal armor of the Panther tanks, forcing the defenders to aim for track assemblies and side armor in desperate attempts to disable the advancing vehicles. Sergeant Perconi, commanding a machine gun team in the center of the German attack, maintained continuous fire until his weapon's barrel glowed red-hot. German infantry attempting to advance behind their tanks found themselves caught in devastating crossfire from multiple American positions, but their sheer numbers allowed some units to penetrate the defensive perimeter, fall back to secondary positions, ordered Captain Winters as German forces established a foothold within the American lines. The withdrawal was conducted with the discipline of veteran troops, with each squad covering the movement of the next, while maintaining effective fire on the advancing enemy. The battle for Bastogne's eastern approaches raged throughout the morning, with the outcome hanging in the balance. German forces had achieved their deepest penetration of the American defenses, threatening to split the 101st Airborne's position and capture the town itself. Only the courage and skill of individual paratroopers prevented a complete breakthrough. Corporal Hendricks, his machine gun team reduced to 2 men, continued to fire from a position that had been bypassed by German infantry. Surrounded but not silenced, he and Private Donald Malarkey held their ground for over an hour, disrupting German communications and preventing the enemy from exploiting their initial success. The crisis reached its peak at noon when German tanks actually entered the outskirts of Bastogne, their guns firing directly at American positions within the town itself. Buildings collapsed under the impact of tank rounds, while civilians huddled in cellars and basements as the battle raged overhead. General McAuliffe, his command post threatened by approaching German forces, refused to consider evacuation. "We came here to fight," he told his staff officers. "We'll fight from here until we can't fight anymore." The turning point came when American artillery, conserving ammunition throughout the siege, unleashed a concentrated barrage on the German spearhead. Every remaining shell was fired in a desperate gamble to halt the enemy advance. The devastating artillery fire, directed by forward observers who remained at their posts despite being surrounded, finally broke the momentum of the German attack. As afternoon turned to evening, the Wehrmacht forces began to withdraw from their advanced positions, unable to maintain their assault in the face of determined American resistance. The cost had been enormous for both sides. The 101st Airborne Division was reduced to less than 60% of its original strength, while German losses had been even more severe. As darkness fell on December 23rd, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne had survived their greatest test. Though battered and bloodied, they still held Bastogne, but with ammunition nearly exhausted and casualties mounting hourly, everyone knew that one more major German assault could spell the end of the heroic defense. The morning of December 24th brought an unexpected Christmas gift to the besieged defenders of Bastogne. Clear skies for the first time in over a week. As Staff Sergeant Rodriguez looked up from his foxhole, He could see blue sky through the dispersing clouds, a sight that meant Allied aircraft could finally reach the surrounded garrison. The first C-47 transport planes appeared at 0900 hours, flying in tight formation despite heavy German anti-aircraft fire. The paratroopers cheered as colored parachutes blossomed in the sky above Bastogne, carrying desperately needed ammunition, medical supplies, and food to the defenders. For the first time since the siege began, hope seemed justified. Private Walsh, his head wound bandaged but still manning his position, watched the supply drop with tears of relief in his eyes. "Merry Christmas, you beautiful bastards," he shouted at the circling aircraft, his voice joining hundreds of others raised in celebration throughout the American perimeter. The resupply mission was followed by waves of P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers that attacked German positions with devastating effect. The close air support, coordinated by ground controllers within Bastogne, struck supply columns, artillery positions, and troop concentrations that had been immune from American retaliation during the period of bad weather. Captain Eugene Rowe received the medical supplies with profound gratitude, finally able to provide proper treatment for the wounded who had been suffering without adequate care. Morphine, plasma, bandages, and surgical instruments allowed him to save lives that would otherwise have been lost to the siege's harsh conditions. Lieutenant Colonel Chapuis studied the tactical situation from his rebuilt command post, noting significant changes in German dispositions. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces were beginning to withdraw heavy equipment toward the east, suggesting that the Wehrmacht High Command was losing confidence in their ability to capture Bastogne. The strategic situation was changing rapidly as well. General Patton's Third Army had finally begun its relief attack, with elements of the 4th Armored Division driving northward through Luxembourg against fierce German resistance. Radio communications confirmed that American forces were fighting to within 10 miles of Bastogne's southern perimeter. On December 25th, Christmas Day, the siege entered its final phase. German forces launched one last desperate assault against the American positions, throwing everything remaining against the 101st Airborne's defenses. The attack came at dawn, preceded by a brief but intense artillery barrage that expended much of the enemy's remaining ammunition. Sergeant Rodriguez and his depleted squad met the German assault with steady, disciplined fire. The attackers, many of them young soldiers rushed from training units to fill gaps in veteran formations, lacked the skill and determination of the troops who had begun the siege. Their advance quickly stalled under accurate American marksmanship. The breakthrough came at 1400 hours on December 26th, when the distinctive silhouette of American Sherman tanks appeared on the southern horizon. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, leading the vanguard of the 4th Armored Division, had finally broken through German defenses to reach the besieged garrison. "Hot damn, it's Patton's boys," shouted Captain Winters as the relief column approached the American perimeter. The paratroopers emerged from their positions to greet their rescuers, many of them openly weeping with relief and exhaustion after 10 days of constant combat. The official link-up occurred when elements of Combat Command Reserve contacted the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion at the southern edge of Bastogne's defensive perimeter. The siege was officially broken, though fighting would continue for several more days as German forces conducted a fighting withdrawal toward their original positions. General McAuliffe greeted the relief force commanders with characteristic understatement. "How are you, General?" asked General Hugh Gaffey, commanding the 4th Armored Division. McAuliffe replied with a grin, "Gee, I'm mighty glad to see you." The cost of holding Bastogne had been enormous. The 101st Airborne Division suffered over 3,000 casualties during the siege, including nearly 600 killed in action. German losses were even higher, with entire regiments effectively destroyed in their attempts to capture the crucial crossroads town. As the siege officially ended and reinforcements poured into Bastogne, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez reflected on what his unit had accomplished against overwhelming odds. Surrounded and outnumbered, the paratroopers had held their ground and denied the Germans a strategic objective that could have changed the course of the war, as in American military history, embodying the spirit that would ultimately lead to victory in Europe. The Screaming Eagles had lived up to their motto. They had indeed been rendezvous with destiny.